Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're sort of pulling back the curtain on something pretty fundamental to all of us. Our emotional well-being, our sense of self. I mean, how often do we really stop and think about what builds our inner strength? Our resilience, our feeling of worth.
It's a huge question, isn't it? And back in the mid-20th century, titans of modern psychotherapy really reshaped how we started looking at it. Nathaniel Branden and Ellis,
Right.
they were really instrumental in moving psychology away from those older, sometimes quite rigid psychoanalytic ways of thinking.
Which were very past-focused, right?
Exactly. Focused on the unconscious, past experiences, often quite passive for the client. Branden and Ellis pushed towards more active, present-focused, and, cognitively oriented approaches. It was a big shift, a real paradigm shift, actually.
So our mission today, really, is to unpack their contributions. They were distinct, definitely, but also complementary in some ways. We want to get into their core ideas, look at their unique therapeutic methods, and also uncover the disagreements, the points of contention, and, some surprising and even controversial bits that shape their legacies.
And what's really striking, I think, despite all their differences, is this common thread running through their work. This deep connection between how we think, how we feel, and how we act. Cognition, emotion, behavior.
They saw them as interlinked.
Absolutely. Implicitly or explicitly, they both got that this interplay was fundamental to psychological health. It's not just about what happens to you, but how you think about it and how that thinking shapes your feelings, your actions, everything.
Okay, so let's kick off this deep dive with Nathaniel Branden. His early life was, tied up with a major intellectual movement before he really carved out his own path understanding the self.
Yeah, born in 1930, he really dedicated his life to this idea of self-esteem. He even defined it quite formally, didn't he?
He did. The disposition to experience oneself as competent to cope with the basic challenges of life and as worthy of happiness. It's that dual focus is key, right? Competence and worthiness.
Exactly. Confidence and worth. And Branden used this powerful analogy, self-esteem as the immune system of consciousness.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, think about it. A weak physical immune system leaves you vulnerable to illness. Branden argued it's the same mentally. Low self-esteem. You're more open to defensiveness, anxiety, depression, relationship problems.
It's like your baseline resilience.
Precisely. It's the bedrock for your mental resilience, your ability to regenerate, to bounce back from stuff.
So it's not just feeling bad if your self-esteem is low. It makes you susceptible to a whole range of psychological issues. Now, you mentioned his early life. Before the self-esteem work really took center stage, he was prominent in Ayn Rand's objectivism circle.
Very prominent. He ran the Nathaniel Branden Institute, NBI. He was a leading figure.
But that association ended quite dramatically.
Oh, yeah. There was a really acrimonious split with Rand in 1968, a big public falling out. And after that, he really focused independently on developing his own psychological theories, especially around self-esteem, away from the objectivist framework.
Okay, so Branden saw self-esteem as something you do, something active. So how did he suggest people actually, build it? I know about his 6 pillars. What were they about?
Right, the 6 pillars. They're essentially action-based practices, things you incorporate into daily life. He really stressed that self-esteem is built through action, not passive reception.
So give us an example.
Okay, well, one is the practice of living consciously. That means really trying to be aware, think for yourself, respect facts, be present in the moment, take responsibility for your understanding. It's about aligning how you act with what you actually perceive.
That sounds demanding. Like you said, active. Did he acknowledge it takes effort, especially if you're already struggling?
He did emphasize they were practices, things you work at. Another key one is the practice of self-acceptance. Really acknowledging and, importantly, embracing all parts of yourself flaws included with compassion, not judgment.
Okay.
And then there's the practice of self-responsibility. Owning your choices, your actions, seeing yourself as the cause of the effects you want, rather than blaming external factors.
And he also developed a specific technique, didn't he? Sentence completion.
Yes, the sentence completion method. Really prominent and quite original. The therapist gives you an incomplete sentence, a stem, like, if my fear could speak, it might say.
Okay.
And then you, the client, just rapidly fire off multiple endings without censoring. The idea is to tap into immediate awareness, get quick insights. He saw it as a kind of psychological discipline that, if you did it daily, could lead to almost spontaneous changes in behavior.
Interesting. Did his overall therapeutic approach stay purely cognitive, or did it evolve?
Oh, it definitely evolved. He started out much more focused on cognition, yes, but from the 70s onward, he moved towards what he called a technically eclectic stance, meaning he started integrating other methods, experiential stuff like Gestalt therapy focusing on the here and now psychodrama using role play.
Right.
And even later in his career, things like energy psychology techniques, particularly for dealing with trauma. He was actually quite ahead of his time in recognizing how problems manifest.
How so?
Well, he talked about issues existing above the line, conscious thoughts, choices, volitional behavior, and below the line, like unconscious trauma stored physically in the body, showing up as gut feelings or chronic tension.
Wow, that really does anticipate the later focus on trauma-informed care and somatic therapies.
It really does. Quite forward thinking for the time.
So his book, The Six Pillars of Self-Esteem, it's often called a classic. It seems like it offered valuable insights for lots of people, individuals, parents, teachers, managers.
Definitely influential.
But, even classics get critiqued. I understand there was some pushback, not just theoretically, but on the practical side. Like how easy it was to apply his methods.
Yes, that's fair. Theoretically, some critics felt his strong emphasis on individual responsibility maybe overlooked systemic factors, societal pressures, economic conditions, things outside the individual that definitely impact self-esteem.
Right, the bigger picture.
Exactly. And on the practical application of the book, yeah, while it's a classic, some readers found it, well, overrated maybe, or felt it got repetitive. And those sentence completion exercises.
The daily ones.
Branden suggested they shouldn't take long, maybe 10 minutes, but some people found them kind of stupid or actually very time-consuming.
Okay.
So it highlights that perennial challenge, right? How do you bridge these really profound theoretical ideas into something that people can consistently, effectively apply day to day, especially just from a book?
That makes sense. Okay, so we've got Branden's vision, building self-esteem from the inside out through conscious action. Now, around the same time he was refining these ideas, another giant was emerging, Albert Ellis, with a maybe more confrontational path.
Yes, Albert Ellis, the pioneer of rational emotive behavior therapy, REBT, developed it back in the mid-1950s.
And what was his big revolutionary idea?
Fundamentally, Ellis just blew up the common idea that external events directly cause our emotional problems.
So it's not the event itself.
Nope. REBT's core idea is that our problems, emotional, behavioral, stem from our irrational beliefs about those events. He really zeroed in on imperative thoughts, those absolutist words like must, should, ought, never. It's not the bad grade, it's telling yourself, I must never fail, or this shouldn't have happened.
That's the problematic part.
That's where the distress comes from, according to Ellis.
And he had those memorable terms for these thought patterns?
He did. Awfulizing. That's catastrophizing, jumping to the worst possible conclusion.
We all do that sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. And his other famous one, masturbating.
Right.
Which is that rigid, demanding use of musts and shoulds. I must be loved by everyone. Things should go my way. He argued these demands just create emotional turmoil. A bit provocative, that term, but it sticks, doesn't it?
It really does. And it's fascinating. REBT is seen as the kind of original form of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT.
One of the main pillars, yeah.
Which is now basically the gold standard in psychotherapy. So Ellis's focus on challenging those irrational beliefs, how did he actually put that into practice? There must be a system, like an ABC model.
Exactly. The ABC model is the foundation. A is the activating event. C is the emotional consequence. But A doesn't directly cause C. It's mediated by B, your beliefs about A.
A leads to B leads to C.
Precisely. And to change C, you have to work on B. So the model expands to A, B, C, D, E, or even A, B, C, D, E, F. D is for disputing the irrational beliefs.
Okay, challenging them.
Right, which leads to E, the new effect or effective new beliefs, and hopefully F, feeling better.
And the therapist's role in this?
The therapist acts much more like a teacher. Cognitive restructuring is the goal. They actively guide the client to identify, challenge, and then reframe those self-defeating beliefs. It's a very direct, active process.
Can you give us examples of how they dispute those beliefs?
Sure. There are a few main ways. There's logical disputation, asking, okay, you made a mistake on the project. How does it logically follow that you are now a total loser?
Poking holes in the logic.
Exactly. Then, empirical dispute. Where is the actual evidence that making one mistake makes you a total loser? Looking for proof. And pragmatic or functional dispute. Okay, believing you're a total loser, how is that actually helping you right now? Focusing on the usefulness or lack thereof of the belief.
Very practical.
Very. And underlying all this is a key principle Ellis promoted. unconditional acceptance, unconditional self-acceptance, unconditional other acceptance, and unconditional life acceptance. Accepting reality, warts and all.
REBT sounds really direct, clear.
Yeah.
Seems like it would be impactful. But I can imagine that kind of direct, maybe even confrontational style,
Yeah.
it wouldn't be for everyone. And maybe there were controversies.
Oh, definitely. That's a really important part of the story. Ellis himself was known for, let's say, colorful language and strong opinions. His style was confrontational.
Which could be off-putting.
It absolutely turned some people off. Some felt it lacked empathy, could feel overly simplistic, even harsh sometimes.
And were there questions about its effectiveness for certain types of problems?
Yes. Because it's quite an intellectualized therapy, its effectiveness has been questioned for more severe disorders, things like personality disorders, schizophrenia, psychotic disorders, where insight alone might not be sufficient.
Okay.
Plus, a major criticism was that REBT didn't really delve into the background of the emotional issues, the underlying problems. It focused heavily on the current irrational thoughts. And particularly, Ellis was criticized for his apparent unwillingness to recognize the effects of trauma on adult behavior and mental health. That's seen as a significant blind spot.
Wow. Okay. And then there were more serious ethical concerns too, weren't there? Allegations against Ellis himself. This feels important to address, even if difficult.
It is crucial and deeply troubling. Ellis faced severe ethical criticisms later in his career. There were serious allegations that he exploited his position to coerce his female patients into having sex with him.
That's extremely serious.
Extremely. These allegations reportedly cost him his reputation and institute. Some accounts described him as notoriously selfish, rude, and short-tempered, basically unable to practice what he preached about rational living and acceptance. His actions led some to view his theory, or at least its application by him, as quite unethical.
That casts a very dark shadow.
It really does. It profoundly impacted how his work and legacy were viewed, especially later on.
Did anything else affect REBT's sort of standalone popularity compared to other therapies emerging then? Like the research backing it up?
That's another factor, yes. REBT was put out there, disseminated, without a huge amount of empirical evidence supporting it right at the start.
Unlike Beck's cognitive therapy.
Exactly. Aaron Beck's cognitive therapy, developed around the same time, had more rigorous research, like randomized clinical trials, backing it up from earlier on. That difference in the early evidence base likely contributed to Beck's CBT gaining wider acceptance and more sticking power in the scientific and clinical communities, even though Ellis laid so much foundational groundwork.
Okay, let's try and bring Branden and Ellis together now for a comparison. Their paths were different, clearly, but maybe aiming for similar goals of psychological well-being. What did they see as the root of psychological problems?
Well, Branden really located the primary source of distress in the unmet need for self-esteem. Coming from his objectivist background initially, he saw deficiency there as the core problem leading to pathology.
Right.
Ellis, on the other hand, drawing more from Stoicism, pointed to irrational beliefs as the main culprit. For him, it was about faulty thinking, faulty perception, and interpretation of events.
So deficiency versus distortion, maybe.
Kind of, yeah. And that difference played out in their therapeutic styles, too.
How so?
Branden's approach was more about internal work, action-based practices, experiential methods. The therapist was more of a facilitator, helping the person build something from within. He brought in gestalt, psychodrama, even energy work later.
More eclectic.
Definitely eclectic later on. Ellis was much more directive. The therapist as teacher, actively disputing irrational thoughts, focusing squarely on cognitive restructuring.
Very different style.
Very different. But interestingly, both really emphasize consistent practice. Homework assignments were key for both. They understood that change doesn't happen just in the therapy hour. It requires ongoing effort.
Sustained change needs practice. Now, given these differences, did they ever directly clash, like publicly debate their ideas?
They absolutely did. There's a famous public debate on May 26, 1967. The title tells you everything. Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy versus Objectivist Psychology.
Wow, objectivist cytology. That's Branden's side.
Exactly. It was a huge event, apparently over 1,100 people, mostly an objectivist crowd. Reports say Ellis got booed during his talk.
Ouch.
And Ayn Rand herself was there and apparently got extremely upset by what Ellis was saying.
So what was the core of the disagreement? What did Branden take issue with?
Well, years later, Branden wrote that Ellis had been misrepresenting my views for over 3 decades, especially around this idea of self-rating and self-esteem.
How so?
Ellis apparently portrayed Branden's view as saying human worth depended on making good choices or judging your performance as terrific. Branden flatly denied this. He said he never write or talk about who is or is not a worthwhile human being.
So what was Brandon's point?
Branden argued that our choices and actions irresistibly affect how we think and feel about ourselves. Our actions shape our self-concept. He contrasted this with what he saw as Ellis's view, that you could just abstain from self-rating and rationality alone wouldn't really affect your core sense of self.
So it's almost a philosophical difference about whether our actions inherently impact our self-worth versus Ellis's idea of achieving unconditional acceptance regardless of actions by changing beliefs.
Precisely, Branden. Self-esteem is actively built through conscious, responsible action, Ellis. Self-acceptance is more like a rational prerequisite, achieved by challenging irrational beliefs about yourself and your actions, rather than deriving worth from the actions themselves. That 1967 debate really highlighted it wasn't just clinical disagreement, it was rooted in fundamentally different worldviews about human value.
Fascinating clash. Yet, despite all that contention, the different approaches, the controversies, there's still a powerful unifying legacy, wouldn't you say?
I think so, yes. A really strong shared theme is personal agency, responsibility for your own internal state.
How did that show up for each?
Well, Branden's 6 pillars are all about internal practices, things you do. Internally generated practices, he called them. And Ellis's core REBT idea is that events, A, don't cause emotions, C, your beliefs, B, do, and crucially, you have the power to change your beliefs.
It comes back to the individual's power.
Exactly. It's about taking ownership of your inner world.
And Ellis had that really punchy quote summing this up.
Yes, the famous one. The best years of your life are the ones in which you decide your problems are your own. You do not blame them on your mother, the ecology, or the president. You realize that you control your own destiny.
Powerful stuff. Really emphasizes self-control, personal responsibility.
It does, and that message resonates strongly regardless of which specific techniques you prefer, Branden's or Ellis's.
Which brings us towards the end of this deep dive. We've seen Nathaniel Branden, the architect of self-esteem, pushing for internal, action-based ways to build self-worth, even anticipating more holistic, trauma-aware approaches.
And Albert Ellis, the REBT pioneer, laying that crucial groundwork for CBT, which is, arguably the dominant therapeutic model today, the gold standard.
Together, their work really propelled psychotherapy forward, making it more active, more present-focused, more cognitive.
Definitely. And even the criticisms they faced, Branden potentially overlooking systemic issues, Ellis's confrontational style, and especially the grave ethical concerns surrounding Ellis, those criticisms themselves have been incredibly important. They've pushed the field to evolve, to become more nuanced, more integrated, and hopefully more ethically conscious.
That Ellis quote, you realize that you control your own destiny, it's incredibly empowering, but maybe also a bit daunting. It places so much responsibility on the individual. So a final thought for you, the listener. As you think about your own journey, your own well-being, what does this all mean? How do you balance that sense of personal agency with acknowledging the real, external factors that shape our lives? Where's the sweet spot between I control my destiny and understanding the world around us? Something to keep exploring.